right. Oh, that's why you were taking around the car?
Yes, that was why I was taking her in your car. Is this yours? Okay. There's another one in here.
Yeah. Is that the most up-to-date one?
Okay.
Hey everybody, good afternoon. I'm Liz Russell, not Colette Pichon-Battle, but I want to thank everybody for being here and being a part of the Equity Metrics meeting of the Climate Task Force. I have the privilege of being one of the advisory committee members on the Equity Advisory Committee, so am jumping in here to bring us into this conversation and call the meeting to order. I want to make sure everybody is aware that the audio for this meeting is being recorded and will be available as a recording, although I'm not sure how. YouTube, thank you, Olivia. But really just wanted to welcome everybody and again extend gratitude for your making time to be part of this conversation. Obviously, this advisory committee and those of you who have made the time to be here are well aware of the value of centering equity as part of the implementation of the Governor's Climate Initiatives Task Force and our shared effort to get to net zero by 2050 and find the most clear and tangible pathways for doing so while ensuring that we're centering equitable outcomes. Equity metrics and how we think about what is equity and how it's visible and how well we're doing in getting to those equitable outcomes has really been a core tenet of the Equity Advisory Group since the inception of this group. And we think it's really critical to ensure that we're placing value on actually measuring equitable outcomes as we implement climate action. I want to acknowledge that there have been different conversations over the course of the Climate Initiatives Task Force, both as part of the overall task force, as part of the industrial decarbonization meetings, as part of the Equity Advisory Group meetings, that how we actually think about different components of the climate action plan has to be tied to what we think of as equity and equitable outcomes, and has to be might look different. I want to acknowledge that it might look different with different implementation components. So as we think about decarbonization generally of the energy sector, as we think about grid resilience, those are certain pathways towards implementation. As we think about transportation or managing our methane emissions or orphaned wells, there are different ways that we might think about equity in that context. And so I really want to encourage you all who are here today and those of us who may be following along later or submitting comments formally to use your expertise and your role in this landscape to think and imagine and dream about how we can build a more healthy and just and vibrant Louisiana, and how the tremendous investments of especially Bill and Ira from the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act can help us get to those more equitable outcomes. I'm going to be handing it over to the data center after I bring it to Olivia to do a roll call. But I wanted to just remind us that we're going to be wrapping up the phase one of the analysis and and sort of centering on the purpose of this meeting. And our actual facilitator, Colette Pichon Battle, has just walked into the room, so I can hand it over. No, I'm jumping in trying to make it possible. But we're going to be wrapping up the phase 1 of the analysis of the work of the data center on the equity metrics report. This is an opportunity for the advisory group and other allies from Louisiana to provide feedback to this process and provide feedback to the structure of the way we think about equitable outcomes in metric form, if that makes sense. So I'll hand it over to Olivia to do roll call. But thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you, Liz. Colette Pichon Battle. Here. Charles Allen. Here. Jasmine Brown. Oops, accidentally switched that. Steve Cochran. Here. Dr. Kenny Cole. Dr. Craig Colton. Chief Sherelle Parfait Dardar. Ashley Gardier. Dr. David Robinson Morrison. Liz Williams Russell. Here. Larry Soparu. All right, thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate you coming, and I'll echo Liz in saying we really appreciate your expertise and contributing to this conversation. Climate Action Plan, equity metrics. That's a big phrase. It's a big topic. We're going to cover a lot of ground today and do it at kind of a high level. But in order to help us have a productive conversation, I'm going to walk through a bit of table setting today and try to summarize what we found in the process of putting together this strategy. So I'm sure I don't have to remind many people in the room about the fundamental objectives of the CAP. The one that we're highlighting here is to create a more equitable society. And what do we mean when we say that? This is all included in the CAP. Reduce socioeconomic, demographic, and geographic disparities in future opportunities and outcomes. Maximize reduction and mitigation of historical and structural inequities and their impacts for underserved and marginalized communities, including communities of color and indigenous peoples. And maximize engagement with and participation of communities in decision-making and implementation. So you can think about this as really a data strategy in order to support this objective of the CAP. As Liz mentioned, this is phase 1 of the project, and our objectives for this project is to develop a feasible, rigorous, and stakeholder-informed strategy for measuring the CAP's equity outcomes. We had a first stakeholder meeting on November 1st that was held in New Orleans. I know some of the people in the room were able to attend that one. This is the stakeholder meeting, and we'll be looking to deliver a final report at the end of this. The final report is going to be fairly technical in nature, and we're going to cover at a high level some of the technical aspects of it today. But I just want to stress that this is an opportunity to shape the recommendations that are included in the final report. So project outcomes in a nutshell, we're selecting indicators. And in fact, we have a little activity, a little breakout where we're going to talk about this. We've made some suggestions about what do we want to measure for the equity objectives and how do we want to do it. And then secondly, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on this at the end of our few minutes here, is to recommend a set of equity data resources, which is to say that this is not necessarily one resource or one tool or one piece of research or one analysis, but rather a suite of resources for tracking indicators in a way that's usable for folks, in a way that can be sustained over time, in a way that's rigorous, usable, and impactful. And so we're also trying to think really about what needs to be in place for a long-term strategy that meets many needs for climate equity data, some of which we've identified through this process. So just as a review, climate equity indicators, a bit of a jargon word. What do we mean when we say that? They can cover a range of health, socioeconomic, and environmental topics. This is data that can be disaggregated by race, gender, income, place, or some other dimension of disparity or inequity. It can be tracked over time. It can be used to develop policy, to demonstrate the effectiveness of an intervention, and to highlight areas where more action is needed. Importantly, the data strategy should reflect past and present drivers of systemic inequity. So we're not thinking of it just in terms of disparities, but also in a more holistic and structural way. And lastly, we all want to be able to capture progress toward inclusive prosperity. So these are sort of some of the criteria that go on in our head as we're sort of looking and reviewing options for data. So the reason that we're here today and what we're going to do, first of all, I'm Robbie Habens, the economist of the data center, and my colleague Jenna Losh are going to review some of the recommendations for the CAP equity metrics strategy that we've been developing over the past few months. We then want to split off into two structured discussions. One is going to be, we've essentially suggested a number of indicators that will be tracked, and there's a little more to it, and Jenna will cover that in a few minutes. But we like to get feedback on that data. We like to see what kind of stories the data that we've identified connects to. We'd like to see what kind of stories the data we've identified is missing. And that's why, there's kind of a core data component at the center of this, but there's also an agenda for publications and an agenda for resources. In the second conversation, we want to be able to flesh out that agenda so that as we pivot into implementing the strategy, we will be on sound footing. So I'm going to spend a few minutes just reviewing some data. I'm sure you guys have seen a version of this kind of chart many times before. So Louisiana ranks 8th in total emissions. Yes, go ahead. Is that a little better? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Oh, okay. I'll just squat down. Thank you. Okay, so Louisiana ranked 8th in total emissions. It was 7th in emissions per capita, and it was number 1 in emissions from industrial sources. It is one of only 2 states, in fact, where the majority of its emissions are from industrial sources. We know that this is critical to the broader strategy and broader actions outlined in the CAP. But let's try to map that onto questions of equity a little bit. So this is a little bit of a complex chart, so I'm going to build it in layers. On the vertical axis here, we've charted emissions per capita, and the higher up it is, the higher emissions, the lower emissions. On the horizontal axis, we've got the Gini coefficient. This is often used as a measure to summarize inequality. Thank you. And here we have on the left is less than equal and more unequal. So this is just kind of the rules of the chart. Then we're going to plot the United States total right there. That's both the emissions per capita of the United States and the degree of income inequality in the United States. And now we're going to put every state in the United States on that chart. And when we do that, we see that, well, Louisiana kind of stands out there alone, doesn't it? It's the only state that has above average emissions per capita and above average inequality with this one measure, the Gini coefficient. So that really underscores the challenge and the importance of thinking about equity in terms of our emissions reduction goals. Also, we wouldn't be surprised to know that there is a certain geographical pattern in the sources of our greenhouse gas emissions. This is a map of the top 20% of GHG emitting facilities in the state of Louisiana. These 20% of facilities are responsible for about 80% of the emissions. And we also can unpack that income inequality a little bit. And when we do that, as with virtually any indicator that we throw up on a chart like this at the data center, in Louisiana, we continue to have very large and significant disparities by race. This is household income, so it's very similar to the inequality that I showed in the previous chart. But if we were looking at housing cost burden, if we were looking at earnings from work, we would be finding very similar disparities in socioeconomic status by race. If we also look at trends in inequality over time, we can see that in recent years, a larger share of the income gains has gone to households in the state of Louisiana that are in the top 10% of income. By contrast, gains for the This is a mislabel on this chart, I apologize, but it's the middle 40% and then the bottom 50% have been virtually stagnant over the same period. So the trend that we've been on has not necessarily been one that has been tipping us toward equity over the past few years. Then again, the Climate Action Plan is a transformative agenda, and this is, of course, an opportunity to change that. So just to very quickly summarize our feedback from the last meeting. This is meant to be an iterative process. So I've just walked through a little bit of storytelling with data, and really what we're trying to flesh out through this process is to identify stories that we can tell with data, how we should tell them, and for which audiences we should do it. So in the last meeting, we spent quite a bit of time talking through some key audiences for climate equity metrics strategy. We identified a diverse range of users in government, private sector, NGOs, faith communities, researchers, journalists, and average citizens. One thing that really stuck out in that discussion was the importance of local and parish level decision makers, because a lot of the decisions over recommendations in the Climate Action Plan ultimately come down to the local level. But we also began to think through ways that we can do storytelling with data, how to prioritize certain stories, how to frame them in a way that we can measure, and then also to begin to think about the limitations of that data. So we took a lot of that feedback. We tried our best to boil it down. Some of the handouts that you see on your table reflect our current attempt at that, and part of what we're trying to do with that today is to continue to refine the selection of data indicators that we will try to track going forward. And so again, the way that we're thinking about this, and this comes from our experience working at the data center, we think of equity data as a technical problem, and that's a lot of what we've been doing is to look at data sources and think about the limitations of the data and all that kind of in the weeds stuff. We also are trying to use these conversations and to kind of spark additional conversations about the narrative. What is the context that we are providing for the indicators? How do they speak to each other? Can they stand up alone? And how can they be linked back to equity objectives of the CAP? And finally, it's very important to think about usability when you're selecting data. In fact, basically all the recommendations that we put forth today, we were thinking about them in terms of what is the use case and what is the research question. And some of the recommendations have a fairly well-defined use case. Some of them have a fairly well-defined research question. Others are a little bit more general, but this is kind of part of the importance of thinking about this strategically in a way that can meet a variety of needs in a variety of different ways. So we are going to go into quickly summarizing our key recommendations, and we're going to talk through a few of these in more depth with the remainder of our time today. And also, feel free to come up and ask us questions about these too. I know we are kind of going quite fast. This will all be documented in a final report, but we're trying to get there and aren't quite there yet. So just to kind of cover the bases here, we've proposed tracking on an ongoing basis what we're calling the climate equity data collection, and that's going to be a set of indicators that will be updated regularly and available in a relatively accessible way. And these indicators are meant to serve a variety of use cases. There's also an additional series of publications that we're proposing associated with that. And I'm going to hand it off to Jenna to describe this a little bit more. And then I'll come back at the end and describe some of the more specific policy evaluation questions that we've tried to address with these strategies. We're using the term prospective and retrospective, meaning before the adoption of a policy and after the adoption of a policy. But I'll come back in a few minutes and speak a little bit more about those. Jenna.
Thanks. Okay, hey, so again, I'm Jenna. I'm the senior data analyst at the data center. So to get into a little bit of the details on some of these recommendations, to start, kind of our centerpiece recommendation is this data collection. So this is sort of like, this is the indicator project. When we talk about all the indicators we've been selecting, this is the way that we're recommending that we serve them on a website, kind of like a data hub. And I'm trying to kind of toe the line here between not being like totally abstract, but also these are just recommendations. All of the kind of user interface details would have to be worked out kind of in development. But all that said, we are recommending it be served on a website, and we want these indicators to kind of serve as like a set of shared facts. We want to level set climate equity in Louisiana, and at the same time, we want these indicators to serve kind of two uses that would be represented with like two ways to access them through the website. The first would be kind of a narrative analysis. So providing context for all of Louisiana for each indicator, kind of specialized, tailored interpretations of each indicator. And then secondarily, the more modular format of each separate indicator with full interactivity, any geography that we could provide, any year, any race breakdown, irrespective of how we contextualized it with all of the other indicators, would be available through maybe more of like a search page kind of interface where you can look at one or a handful of indicators at a time. And I think that that covers that one. We're going to get into that in much more detail with our first activity. So the indicators that are a part of that are listed in the bottom tier of this chart, and I'm not going to go through this whole thing while it's up on the screen because it's a lot, but you can kind of see the overarching format. We have the whole data collection divided into three main themes. We've got income and well-being, exposure to hazards, and then an inclusive transition. And then within those themes, we're dividing into topics, and under each topic, we have a handful of indicators or measures that will actually be the data that speaks to those areas. So this is what our first activity is going to cover. So again, we're going to revisit that. So to kind of support this like broader narrative, this level setting narrative that's intended to serve such a wide set of use cases, we're recommending an ongoing publication of briefs that are specific to very tailored audiences and very tailored stories. So at the first feedback meeting, we talked a lot about stories with data, and we had some really great feedback on stuff like, difficulty of accessing safe housing and declining property values in industrial areas. So there's a lot to that idea, and we want to be able to explore ideas like that in a timely way as they become relevant to the implementation of the CAP, and in a very specific and tailored way that we don't have to be quite as concerned as that it serves such a broad audience, because in many cases we'll get more bang for our buck if we are like really serving specific needs with those. So in addition to those focused data stories, we would also be publishing these very short briefs as we update the data collection, which would be happening about annually. And it kind of provides an opportunity for us to highlight changes, highlight the status of the CAP implementation and how equity is looking, kind of like a hook to pull people back into this story, back into this work, and just keep things fresh and keep people talking about it and keep people involved and aware. And these briefs may also surface additional indicators that we would want to kind of wrap into the data collection and have available from that searchable aspect as we continue. So it can be flexible to be updated and just adapted to what the needs are. So here's just a list of the suggested brief topics as it stands based on our research and on the feedback from the from the November meeting. And I'm not going to read through them now because this is the whole second part of our meeting today. We're going to go over those in more detail. But just to kind of like give the overview, compare, contrast between how these two resources would work together, the data collection is more of a hub, level setting, fact sharing space for many users, and then the briefs are telling specific stories and not necessarily interactive or web-based, probably more like a PDF style thing. The data collection serves a broad set of uses. The briefs are tailored to a target audience. The data collection would be annually updated but not changed too much, and the briefs would have a periodic publication schedule, probably a little bit more fast-paced at the start, and then just as topics arise that are relevant, maybe every 6 to 12 months for kind of the life of the project, as well as alongside the updates of the data collection. So I think that's my spiel. So we're back to Robbie.
Okay, thanks, Jenna. And yeah, just to reiterate, I mean, this comes from our experience at the data center. we found a lot of value in just making data more accessible to folks, right? And that's really what the data collection is about. Making it easier for people to find and giving it context so that it makes sense to people in our state. However, rarely does data stand up alone on itself, and we know that there will be holes in the data that we've provided. I hope we can identify some of those holes today. But that's really where the briefs come in. It can help carry attention going into the future, because the last thing we would want is something to be built and not be updated, not be maintained, not be paid attention to after its first release. And the briefs are really the hook to do that, as well as to dive deeper into specific issues. And then just to kind of close out with some of the other recommendations, and we're actually going to talk about these a little less today. These can be quite a bit more technical, but I would encourage everybody to come up and pull my ear if you want to talk to it while we're here today. But again, thinking about this in terms of policy evaluation from a prospective or before the fact or retrospective. We'll talk first about prospective. At the highest level, we recommend that it's important to assess the distributional impacts of important CAP actions. That can shape how we think about prioritizing actions. It can shape how we think about implementing actions. And in order to do that, well, there's a lot of tools. It's always kind of a speculative exercise to do prospective evaluation, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't relatively low-hanging fruit for how to do this. In the final report, we are going to talk quite a bit about map-based screening tools. This has almost become a cottage industry over the past couple of years in the United States. Just to give an example, there was a recent review study that reviewed 31 of these tools that have been created in the past few years. So this is a very rapidly adopting set of data resources that a lot of states have done and various federal agencies have done. However, we know that map-based screening tools are limited in the extent to which they can identify the impacts of specific climate policies. They're intended to prioritize areas, and they can be useful for that, but they should not necessarily be the be-all, end-all. So we're kind of recommending that a toolkit is created that helps to navigate these tools. Even if such a tool itself is not necessarily the main core of the data strategy. We also think that there are opportunities to extend existing analytical tools in ways that speak more directly to questions about equity. One of the ones that I'm always reminded of is economic impact analysis. It's the one where we says, if we do the thing, it'll create 1,000 jobs or whatever. Contribute so many millions of dollars to the economy. It's actually fairly straightforward to extend those kinds of analyses to talk about job quality, to talk about emissions and environmental quality, and to talk about how the jobs that are created can affect the distribution of opportunity. It's very rare that people actually do that in that kind of analysis, but it certainly is possible. And cost-benefit analysis is always a touchy topic. It's one that raises a lot of important questions about both climate and equity, and of course climate equity together. Cost-benefit analysis can distort equitable goals, in fact, by the way that it values income, values benefits, values costs, and values assets. But there are ways to extend cost-benefit analysis to supplement it with distributional analysis and to explore modifications to correct for bias that often carries through in the use of cost benefits for decision making. Equity weighting in cost benefit analysis is a rapidly developing field, so we provide some recommendations that are on that framework. And then lastly, the question of retrospective evaluation. This goes along with prospective. Of course, after you do something, you should also evaluate what was the impact of that thing that you did. And we kind of do propose a flexible framework for evaluation, yet it's one that should be expected to be tailored to different interventions in different settings, and overall a strategy that can embrace a diversity of evaluation methods is needed, including qualitative evaluation methods. We would love to explore opportunities to leverage administrative data. I think that that's a very important thing. In fact, state-level administrative data has been identified as one of the most valuable things in screening tools that other states have developed. What's an example of administrative data? So a lot of the data that's written out in the handout is stuff that comes from government surveys or general purpose government data resources. Administrative data would be data that's created in the process of administering some program. I was chit-chatting earlier about zoning policy and zoning changes, permitting changes that happen across the state. So these are examples of administrative data. It could also be data that is produced, I'll just use workforce development as an example. Some data that's generated in the process of administering a workforce development program that could then tell you about, who's accessing the program. Is that happening in an equitable way? What are the outcomes of the program? Is that happening in an equitable way? What are the long-term impacts on career prospects? Is that happening in an equitable way? Thinking about that for the whole of state government is a very complicated thing because there's a lot of data silos, and if we think about local government, that's hundreds of other sources of administrative data. Yet I think exploring opportunities to leverage that could be a very useful thing. And also just frameworks for rapid evaluation. One of the maybe dissatisfying aspects of retrospective evaluation is that we have to wait until we have several years of data before we can see what happened. But there is a lot of developing work about how to accomplish that more rapidly for any application, but especially for climate application, just because of the kind of nature of the problem. So this is all stuff that we're looking to cover in the final report. I'm going to stop talking now, and we might transition to discussion. Just very quickly, does anybody have any questions at this point? Or we can... Okay. Please.
I should know the answer to this question. I'll start off with that. As a result of the climate action plan, is it now set that we'll have annual emissions data, or every 2 years, or every 5 years, or is that? We haven't had it leading up to now, so I'm curious about whether that emissions inventory and track is going to continue on.
Yeah, I might punt that one to Lindsay to help with. I will just mention that EPA produces the data and updates it every year, but I know that there are specific state analysis.
By the time we get it.
Yeah.
And their caps as well. No, so we don't have a mandate for funding set aside for doing an inventory update. So we are right now at the whim of whenever a new facilities commission is done there. We don't even have a recurring 5-year update.
So if I could ask this, so in other words, in order to get that, we gotta take some sort of legislative power,
Right, we're currently.
Well, I think it'll be in some way maybe contingent on federal mandates as well, because I know the education sector.
Say that loud.
It might also be the result of federal mandates as well. Because, for example, there's a new mandate, I'm not sure, you need to start measuring transportation emissions, so they're gonna link funding on that. Of course, that'll depend on.
And let me ask this question, I just feel like I gotta ask this out loud, I might have asked it previously and I have here. Do we have any allies in the state legislature to, an upcoming session that could carry water on us, get across the finish line, And if you can't say it openly like this, here we can talk. I just feel like the question's gotta be asked,
Some of that discussion will come in the second activity we do,
Yes.
actually, so that'll be really helpful, the opportunity to get into that a little. Okay, are we ready for the first activity? You wanna just do one?
Yeah.
Did y'all want to do one table small group or
We're gonna do 2 small.
Okay, so we'll stand if everyone wants to move to one table. There's enough chairs for everyone.
Yeah.
Which one are we going to? We're going to that one?
Yeah.
Or here?
No.
Musical chairs.
So we're all gonna do both now? Let's do
Yeah. jobs, minority owned businesses, the employment rate, and educational attainment. So I'm not going to go through this whole table because it's the exact same indicators, but for each indicator there's information about the source, what equity breakdowns are available, how often the data updates, and what the geography, what available geographies are. So just to kind of rehash the questions, we're looking at stories, anything I might be missing, talking about the hierarchy and like labeling, just for clarity's sake, and then maybe how an audience, a specific audience we have in mind or might be a part of relates to this. I don't know if that's too
And if anyone has any questions, like we can clarify.
Yeah.
So are y'all looking for suggestions on these data points, or just like reactions to the buckets? Is that reactions, additions?
Yeah, yeah. I think that exactly.
Or also what is subtractions too? What is missing? What is not there that you should be there?
So we'll give you a couple minutes to take a look through the different data sets that are on the table and thinking about the questions that we've raised, and then we'll talk through them one by one in the two groupings that are there. So we can organize the conversation.
Do you have a question?
No.
Under income inequality, you've got median household income, and then economic growth, you've got personal income per capita. This is just a detailed question, but is there a reason one of those is in one place and the other one is in the other? What's the difference statistically between median household income? I know what goes into it, but why is one under income and the other economic? Does it really matter?
So median household income is just a general measure of what standard of living. Whereas so I think the other one was about the inclusive transition. So that's really more about the function of our economy. And it's going to be linked more to wages and income and less to family structure. So I mean, but you're right. It's a bit of a gray area. We thought
Okay, and I don't mean to, just see if there's a big difference in the market.
there is a difference in the two. But these kinds of stories is like useful feedback. If it doesn't make sense to us now, then it might not make sense in the future.
I can see where it would though. I can see where it would make sense in terms of like local competitiveness with wages in certain sectors.
And it might be helpful to also think about the geographic level that they would be listed in. So the DEA data for the income per capita is the smallest geographically parish, whereas the income data we may present as small as the block group, which is basically like
One other just practical question on sources, I think Dr. Owens do, all of these that completely accessible public sources?
yes.
All of them except for some of the jobs.
Yeah, like master cards and subscriptions.
Not to get lost in the weeds, there are publicly available options for that, but there are reasons that we will use it. We made it as public. It will be made public.
I'm just thinking back going forward, access to the sources is way of sort of trying to keep things up to date.
Yeah, so all of these are federal data sources. It's not state data sources. So it takes something here that we got and change the federal data sources to make one go away.
So that's
Sometimes they
different.
have to.
Actually, we're concerned about state government as a
Right.
I'm gonna just 1 second that as Tom has a question. We've got about 14 minutes left, so maybe I'm just gonna suggest we want to have more structured, like 7 minutes about the first set of indicators and 7 minutes about the
credit is one that would tie in between income inequality and exposure to hazards, just in terms of people being able to like buy gas for a generator or pay to leave town before FEMA reimburses you, if ever. I also wonder if there's health data on respiratory illnesses that would be federally updated, or cancer tumor registry. Again, some of that is health at the state level, so not, you're gonna have to
have lived through a disaster, particularly because that certainly has impact on their wealth and their status, and be able to cross-reference that within this data set. Having once talked to a woman of color in the state of Louisiana who was offered $53,000 for her neighbor, a similar house, same flooding, was offered considerably more by adjusters, and also having once counseled a congregant whose entire little shopping center, which she and her husband had acquired a few years ago, was offered $67,000 by the insurance company to settle this real quick, fast, because the insurance agent didn't know whether the same offer would be available tomorrow. Eventually settling for a little over $500,000 after going to court. All of these things are indicators that affect people in our state. And when we talk about equity, it seems to me we should reflect the whole big picture of folks like you and I and all of the rest of it.
The situation's leading to the mental health distress status level for certain.
I'm also interested in what does it mean, sea level rise? I see that as something here, an area in which I perhaps have more concern than many people in Louisiana. The sea level rise, what are we gathering on sea level rise? What's its relevance and how is it being shared? As land and infrastructure.
Yeah, so I would just briefly on that, I think it's kind of in conjunction with the land loss indicator that's in the same section, really speaking to like people whose homes are threatened by permanent inundation. They are so vulnerable to the climate, and by virtue of that will be like the most drastically impacted by whatever adaptations the state chooses to implement to address that. So it's sort of like, it's timely, people like to talk about it a lot, it comes up a lot, and maybe it's a story that ultimately we won't want to weave in, but it just seems like a bellwether.
So I'll jump in and say, I think we've mostly been talking about income and well-being, and that was kind of an easier one for us because the exposure to hazards was harder. And yet, I think we've identified a lot of good problems. The insurance adjustment question, I think that's another area where, frankly, I don't believe that there's good, readily available data. A lot of the data lives in the private sector, in that, because you're talking about private insurance companies, insurance adjustment. But I think it's great to be able to document these things. And Jenna, did we still want to spend a couple minutes just like the exposure to hazards, or are you going to leave it down already?
Yeah, I think, maybe let's just, if there's any focused feedback on the exposure to hazard section specifically now, just looking
I just want to jump in too and say, like, okay, so one of the things we're struggling with is just availability of data. So we're trying to pick kind of like the accessible data that has been used for similar studies in the past that we know what we can do. Part of the other big limitations, and thank you, Colette, for bringing this up, but one of the struggles when you do this kind of work is avoiding the consistent deficit lens that data like this can lead us into. And
Consistent what?
just the deficit lens is the way it's termed sometimes, but the notion that all the data is bad because it's always still and frankly, that's because that's the way the data is. It's not right. And the kind of information is almost not. I think we could try not to.
So just to say, the timer has
some of these are things that state kind of already produces. So the state's already producing those in Safe Drinking Water Act compliance for like safe drinking water violations. It's already producing impaired water waste. This is through the B and through 5B report with water. So maybe.
Okay, one last.
I'm not sure where this would go or how it would fall, but gentrification and like I don't know, like the recurring impact of like people coming into like literally being completely displaced and moved out of their homes and not being able to afford them. But the numbers on that, like I can't actually think about how to word to like to get like how you would put a number on it, right? Data on that, yeah, something surrounding how significant the impact or the percentage of like, the rate that it's growing or something in specific neighborhoods.
Yeah, and you know, maybe some of these more complex stories, the briefs can be a good way to like actually set aside the research time and hopefully actually surface or even create an indicator that could become like an ongoing measure. And so on that tip, let's go ahead and pivot to the second portion. We're going to start with a phone poll. If everyone can be a good sport and play along. We have 2 questions that we're going to do a quick phone poll to get us thinking about the briefs. Let's see. Oh, wow, I did it. Okay, so if you go on your phone to menti.com, MENTI, and then there's a code right there. Can everybody read that? Does anybody? I can write it on a piece of paper if you can't read it and bring it to you. So this question, it's kind of weird. It gives you 100 points, and you can allocate, and you can take points away from other places where people have allocated. You know, feel free to play with it, or just put out however many you want. You can submit, even if you've just done 10 points. So. Is anybody having any trouble? I can come. Yeah, if anyone needs me help. And I hope it was clear, this is the preliminary brief topics that the list that we've recommended so far, based on our stuff and the feedback that we got last year. And I think that counts how many people have responded to so far. Okay, so just to like briefly, feel free to continue putting in your responses. We'll record all of the responses in the anonymously in aggregate in the report. So it looks like health and housing are really taking the top spots. We got like half the weight put in those guys. Workers coming next. I think this is pretty much how it was organized on the thing, which is good, I guess. Maybe it's just intuitive. Okay, so I think like the interpretation of this would be like, let's first get out the like key stories, really which we had already started talking about when we were getting into the indicators, about health and healthcare, and then housing, access, insurance, property values. Those should really be the first priority. And we're gonna have a chance to talk about that when we go into the discussion portion of this next
What is meant by parish capacity?
Yeah, so that one came out of the first feedback meeting, and there was just a lot of feedback about how the parishes have really, really variable levels of capacity to be aware of the equity impacts they're having, of the choices that are actually available to them, applying for grant funding for, specific decisions that would increase equity. So sort of just thinking through, like, do we have the state try and supplement capacity? Do we try and provide something for low capacity parishes to have better access? Like, how do we work with that limited capacity?
Yeah, that came out of conversation, I think, for federal funding, a lot being put with local and parish and local capacity, local governments, municipalities, and them not having the staff to follow their police things.
I can attest to that personally. I've been working on it. Oh, every day I figure out.
Can I just make one quick comment on zoning and permitting and how it's related to the second one, which is housing quality and access? I think a big gap is with some spatial and temporal granularity where housing is being built at a regional level. So it's all broken down by jurisdiction, but we've gone over to the regional level, and there's very convincing research that actually over the last decade or so, the exposure in hazards has increased not because of climate change, but because of the fact that we disproportionately build nationally in areas that are higher hazard. So a parcel that has a higher hazard has a higher probability of being developed than one that has low hazard at a metropolitan level. And so I think that zoning and permitting data is, maybe it's just a bridge too far, but it's hard to talk about the home insurance
Yeah.
without understanding the implications of that going forward.
Thank you. Okay, there's going to be the opportunity to dig into that in just a moment when we go to our little stations. But we have one more quick, this is a word cloud poll option. So just any other topics that haven't come up, or maybe throw in I feel like it does fit into the housing story, and we would get there, especially since we've already recorded that feedback, but gentrification or whatever, other ideas.
So given that, so I think that
We haven't talked about it, and I feel like it's a big elephant in the room, especially where a lot of us live. But is there room to fit in discussion around and indicators on violent crime? And crime can get teased out in so many ways. But it's an issue that's tearing apart. And of course, that can be linked to access to gun, access to what I'm gonna call the weapons of mass destruction. We really are living through the war and the hunt and the pains of weapons of mass destruction. George W. Bush didn't have anything on that. He prosecuted that war case, the same subject. We are dealing with that right now. In New Orleans, I guess in that really area, you name it. We go to bed to the news about crime. We wake up in the morning to the news about crime. And of course, it has a lot to deal with the other, the very desperate story that everybody is facing. My great grandmother said years ago, in desperate times, people step out of character. And we've covered all the other desperation that leads to why we do harm to one another. But I feel like we just need to make some space for that.
What's really interesting about what you're saying is that there's at least 2 new studies about environmental toxins and the impact of it. Like what it is to live next to all of this stuff, what it does to your brain function and your physiological inhibitions and things like that. So I think you're actually making a really interesting point, especially if our emissions we have the largest industrial emission, which means we have probably exponential times exposure. What does that look like when it comes to things that are, sort of not
put on there an indicator that deals with crime and see how the crime situation improves if the other indicators improve. Okay? How much grass gets to that tree over there if the spigot of water is turned on over here? Okay? Again, my great grandmother said, in desperate times, people step out of character. When you're desperate, you do harm to your neighbor. Okay? You think less of your neighbor. You be fearful of your neighbor. You think he's a scoundrel. You don't even know him at all. Okay? You don't even know him. You know.
I would say that ties, I think, directly to like displacements and relocation, because how many people are really moving out of these major cities because they do not want to deal with the violent crime.
Yeah.
Which has a direct relation to education, to access to distance to environmental degrading, things in general. So I think that all the time.
I think about how recently when the comedian Boogie B was just snuffed out of life as he got back to New Orleans for the holidays. And like a day or so later, his mother didn't and she said, I moved to Slidell thinking I was going to avoid this, or I could avoid this. Lo and behold, the issue is at my house. I'm burying my child.
It's interesting that you're saying Slidell because St. Family Parish is receiving those numbers of migration. Right?
Yeah.
So if you actually tie the story into the displacement from the migration that you brought up, they're actually tying. I mean, I live in Slidell, I'm telling you, it's a very recent place now. And it wasn't receiving, receiving all of the impacts. And by the way, they moved a lot of the folks into a flood zone, into a floodplain. They gave them first time houses, they targeted black folks and brown folks. And now they live on top of a dump in a floodplain because, and they
Should we consider the city communities too, right?
Right.
And there's the other talking about the communities receiving the displaced community and the support that they have in assisting the displaced community. So
and the environmental hazards that are there when new people come, that they don't know what's coming. I think that's.
Sorry if we took you off.
No, I mean, really, really interesting stuff, and I think we'll have had notes on that conversation. I think, right, everything in this meeting is like public comment, technically. So we have notes and everything, and also, as we move into the next activity, where we can talk about that topic, any of the topics, any topic that comes to mind, or the list of topics that, the first poll covered for the briefs. We want to get feedback about a few things, kind of like scheduling and impacting, almost like strategy of the briefs. So we're passing out the post-it notes so that if you wish, you can kind of write out responses to, let me just like go over some other kind of like questions that we wanted to cover for that. So given a brief topic, you can answer anything, any of the following questions. What story about that topic would be impactful to present? What audiences might most benefit from a brief on that topic? How might it be used? For example, who might use that data and analysis in that brief in their direct work, in their organization, or to influence some other person's work, like access to lobbyists or whatever that path might be. What priorities will help to set the schedule for releasing the briefs? For example, based on community or y'all's expertise about what briefs might have first impact, or the willingness of an audience to actually listen to a brief. So like maybe a timely topic for a really unwilling audience, and that's something we talk about in a different way. That people who are like, please give us some data and information on this, so that we can make this change and defend these moves that we're trying to make. So I would say go ahead and make sure that for each thought you want to share, put at the top the topic that it's about, and then just whatever you have to say about the story, about the audience, about the strategy, when it should be published, if there's specific actions or specific groups that will be like really tied to that topic. Sure, yeah.
what we're trying to do with narrowing down these topics for brief publications. We're trying to set an agenda here. We can't answer all these questions tomorrow. So insofar as we kind of project out now, I think we'd like to kind of go in order if we can, and we'll start with housing access, home insurance, and property values, which I think was health, I think the number one.
No, I think housing was number two. And I think the
do the damn thing, but let's not give up on it.
I totally agree with that, because of where the climate action, document ended.
Yeah.
It ended with like a lot of stuff aggregated and hierarchy and clarification, but no real demand from the legislature. And what's clear is that to move on half of this stuff,
Right.
you're gonna need the legislature engaged. If the briefs, at the very least, target these decision makers
say that some of this needs a good introduction, that may be something we haven't seen in, the papers, that focus on the LSU scores. Which is important, part of it.
I was gonna say, I know that I've seen some mentions about this before, but just, yes, the legislature is, I agree that it's a great space to start, finish, go with the whole time, but also just giving really large focus to local decision makers and local influencers who, I mean, city council members and commissions and zoning boards, like, there are double the amount of local and, on the ground, like, folks in cities, who are decision makers and there are who are state decision makers. So why are we not, I'm not saying why we're not, but there should be a very large percentage of focus to prioritizing those folks who have a direct relation to their constituents, who can then talk about jobs and workforce development, who can talk about putting more into, talking to the city mayors, putting more into the budget for resources and for those for that development as well. So I would honestly say, to me, it's almost an equal footing actually to having city and state and district-based legislation that changes some things around the stuff people are most concerned about, especially those jobs. And even more, I was thinking about one more thing. How many of these industries are recruiting out of state folks to come and work in Louisiana? Are recruiting contractors to come temporarily be here, and they're paying them a significant amount more? I need to say personally, my friends are pharmacists, and maybe during COVID, like during the pandemic, they were bringing in top nurses and pharmacists who were making triple what people in our state, who are residents of our state, are making. So how does that influence not only how many people are coming in, and some people would even think like taking jobs, I don't know if those are words I would use, but that space versus also leaving to pursue those things because they're not getting that access in their city and their state. Those are two different things, I just saying, but I think
And I would like to briefly address, I think other nations have done better because it started sooner. And I think our 2030 goal, we, as positive, optimistic want to look at it, we have to go further to 2050. Like, I think strategically it's dramatic, but 2030 I don't see as achievable as we might, hope for.
just figure out how to fix it. We're just telling you there's issues that you can fix. No, like there's issues that need to be fixed. Some people are showing that there are beneficial solutions to this, and others will still, you know, we have suggestions for what the solutions can be. But and I mean, for people's stories specifically, I'm saying like there are people who obviously have great suggestions on what they can do, what the government or whoever can do to repair their problem. So putting those people in emphasis instead, you have a story that has a somewhat of a solution already, or a tangible solution that you can tell directly to the government, to the legislators.
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, there was a few moments on the task force where, there weren't many, where you could feel like, some alignment. And there was this one piece about, the possibilities around renewable manufacturing in South Louisiana, specifically wind, specifically, I believe maybe the Fouche area, but what the bigger point I'm trying to make is, I'm saddened and shocked at how the human story is not the most effective story. I'm really sad about that. I mean, I can't tell you. For us to be such a deep Christian state, and for us to just have all of these other values, I'm sad that that story is not good. I'm also sad that the story that seems to be effective is jobs, but also like maybe possibility. And the one thing I kept saying as a member of the task force was, we could be a leader. We don't just have to be like the poorest state in the nation. We could be a leader. And we don't have to be the sickest state in the nation. We could clean this up. We could be a leader. And I think there's something here that is inspirational about this moment, this critical moment. If we make bold, courageous choices toward change, we could be from the back of these lists to the front of these lists. We could be a leader. We could be a beacon. Maybe that even isn't good enough anymore. But it feels like there's something about addressing this industry and the fear of the workers that they've been told, because the true impacts of these industries have never been told. The jobs are not as good as they say, etc. It just feels like we need to figure out how to lift up a position of power as opposed to a position of, we have so much work to do, like not that position. Like, you know, who wants to do that right now? Nobody. But who wants to win? Everybody who loves the Saints and LSU wants to win. Right. Anyway, just thinking that as a perspective in these stories and the approach to it.
And the point that you raised earlier on highlighting the ways that we're winning,
Yeah.
basically the things that we are doing well in equity.
And I didn't say me.
Not what
I
you
said our points of strength and power. Because the way we talk about legislation and the way this country and this government works is terrible. But it is all of our programs, and that's why we have the data. All of our programs start with the premise that people need help, and you have to help them. The government has to help them. But the better way to start, a power way to start, is to say people have things.
Right.
And what can we do to build that, to build more power around it? Like just, you're not starting with nothing, you're not starting as a victim, you're starting as an autonomous lover of Louisiana. Now what do we do from there? You know, that's a very different starting point. So I was saying, we have assets, we have networks, we have power. How do we tell that story and then build from there? Because that gets you away from the, I'm gonna lose my job, which is, I'm gonna redefine how I contribute my labor to this society. That's a very different, that's a very different perspective.
So I would ask, I know we're already over 2 minutes, but just for 1 minute to raise for any initial ideas on what are those positive areas that we can have and then Tom aside.
Well, I was just gonna go back to the idea of anchoring with policies, and maybe it's about setting a vision, or to think about how, for example, this big problem, if you want to have climate action,
like, if the brief is a story about energy efficiency, it's also pointing to a bigger percentage reduction that was in the document. Do you understand my
Like
meaning
connect
here?
each one back to
Connect
how it.
to the percentage, whatever that word was, what's the percentile y'all was talking about? What is it?
Not
Decile.
decile.
Wages by decile.
Yeah,
Okay.
by decile, so let's do this one by like this is like percentage impact, right?
Yeah.
Energy efficiency has a particular percentage impact, because that was my biggest sadness with that document, is that we let all of this stuff get in. I see Harry over here. Let all of these options get in, because there are a menu of options, sure. My statement over and over again was, then let's invest our time and money in the thing that's gonna make the greatest impact. And it was easy, it was low-hanging fruit, making big impact. Energy efficiency, why? Let's maybe think about a briefing story that is such a big impact, has some ability to say positive things. Positive things with energy efficiency is your bill went down.
That's right.
You know, I get how you
And
say that.
everybody wants to feel
Everybody
everything.
wants to know that, so, just offering that as a start.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
fine.
and I just wanted to say, like, the approach that the briefs and papers of that kind that the data center puts out is that we never comment on policy. It's like a baton pass. We'll always have in mind, to some degree, who might benefit